The ferry's engine thrummed a low, persistent lament beneath Dean's worn boots, a vibration that resonated with the hollow ache in his chest. Gray water stretched endlessly, mirroring the sky, a vast, featureless expanse that seemed to swallow sound. He stood at the bow, the salty wind whipping strands of dark hair across his face, tasting of iodine and distant, unseen things. Each crest of the wave was a brief, false promise of land, only to dissolve into another trough. He watched the horizon, a sharp line where the world ended, and knew his own world had ended some time ago. This journey, this desolate destination, was less a new beginning and more a final, desperate attempt to outrun the echoes. The island emerged from the mist like a forgotten thought, a craggy silhouette against the muted light. It was a place of stark, unforgiving beauty, all jagged rock faces and wind-swept heath, crowned by the stoic sentinel of the lighthouse. Dean felt a strange pull, a sense of inevitability. His grandfather's cottage, a tiny, defiant speck of white, clung to the cliffside beneath it. It was exactly as he'd pictured, isolated, defiant, utterly alone. "Last stop, lad," the ferryman's voice rumbled, pulling Dean from his reverie. The man was a broad, weathered figure, his eyes squinting against the perpetual spray. He offered Dean a hand as the ferry scraped against the small, barnacle-encrusted dock. Dean nodded, a silent acknowledgement, and hefted his duffel bag onto his shoulder. Dean was alone, truly alone. A narrow, overgrown track, barely more than a sheep path, snaked its way up the incline towards the lighthouse. The ground was uneven, treacherous, with loose stones and slick patches of moss. As he ascended, the wind intensified, whistling through sparse, skeletal trees that clung precariously to the rocky soil. The only other sign of human habitation, a squat concrete structure with a skeletal anemometer tower, stood silhouetted against the sky on a distant rise, the island's weather station. It looked like a discarded toy, an abandoned monument to a forgotten purpose. He couldn't shake the feeling that even it was watching him, its metal arms perpetually turning, observing the empty expanse. The cottage materialized through a veil of sea mist, closer now, more substantial. It was a small, two-room affair, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, the window frames worked in gray with age. A faint, metallic tang, sharper than the general saltiness, hung in the air around it. The interior was dim, thick with the smell of damp stone, ancient dust, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten flowers or decaying fabric. Dean's grandfather had been a man of few possessions, and the cottage reflected it. A simple wooden table and two chairs, a narrow cot draped with a moth-eaten blanket, a shelf filled with navigation charts and sea-worn tomes. Dean moved through the small space, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the bare floorboards. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy window panes. He found the single bedroom, a cramped space dominated by another cot. On a small, rickety nightstand, amidst a scattering of tarnished brass instruments and a compass whose needle had long since rusted in place, lay a single, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, filled with his grandfather's precise, spidery script. Dean picked it up, the leather cool and dry against his palm. He traced one of the symbols with a fingertip, a faint prickle of unease rippling through him. It was then that he heard it, a sound, faint and indistinct, from somewhere beyond the thick walls. It wasn't the wind, nor the crash of waves against the cliffs. He froze, straining to listen, his breath held tight in his lungs. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the relentless streak of the wind and the relentless, rhythmic sigh of the ocean. Dean told himself it was just the house settling, the old timbers groaning against the persistent island gales. He looked down at the strange symbols in the journal again, then out the grimy window toward the tumultuous gray sea. The island, he realized with a sickening lurch, might offer solitude, but it was not the quiet, empty solace he had so desperately sought. It was a place that held its breath, waiting, and he, Dean, had just walked right into its lungs. He stood at the bow, the salty wind whipping strands of hair across his face, the island growing from a smudged line on the horizon to a rugged silhouette. The cottage stood sentinel on a craggy outcrop, its whitewashed walls stained by generations of sea spray, its single, unblinking eye of a window facing the churning expanse. Dean had expected desolation, but the silence that greeted him upon stepping onto the pebble-strewn path was heavier than anticipated. A thick, muffling blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Inside, dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light piercing the grimy windows. He dropped his duffel bag in the small, Spartan bedroom, the thud echoing in the stillness. No photographs, no trinkets, just a few worn fishing nets draped in a corner, a chipped ceramic mug on the kitchen table. Dean felt a peculiar disappointment, a faint flicker of hope extinguished, that he might find some tangible connection, some explanation for the man's reclusiveness. Days blurred into a routine of unpacking, cleaning and mapping the island's coastline, a task Dean had set for himself as a way to impose order on the chaos within him. He found solace in the meticulous lines of his charts, the precise measurements, the predictable ebb and flow of the tides, until they weren't predictable. He first noticed it on the third morning. The high tide mark was significantly higher than his charts or even the local tide tables suggested. It wasn't a storm surge. The sea was relatively calm, a dull, pewter sheet stretching to the horizon. The water had crept further up the shingle beach, licking at the base of the cottage stone foundation. He marked it down, attributing it to an unusual confluence of lunar phases and atmospheric pressure, a statistical anomaly. But the pattern repeated. The tide seemed to swell and recede with an exaggerated, almost unnatural rhythm, as if the very breath of the ocean was deeper, more forceful. One evening, while sketching the irregular coastline near the jagged cliffs, a sound reached him, carried on the strengthening wind. It wasn't the shriek of a gull or the roar of the waves crashing against the rocks. It was a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the ocean, rising and falling with an unsettling, almost melodic cadence. He paused, pencil hovering over paper, straining to hear it again. He shook his head, dismissing it as the wind playing tricks on his ears, the peculiar acoustics of the cliffs. His grief, he reasoned, was making him susceptible to such imaginings. Later that week, while clearing out the small, cramped study his grandfather had used, Dean found it, tucked beneath a stack of nautical charts yellowed with age. In a drawer that seemed to stick stubbornly was a bound ledger. He pulled it out, the old leather cracking under his fingers. The pages within were thick, heavy paper, many of them warped and crinkled by dampness. It was his grandfather's journal. The script was spidery, almost illegible in places, but Dean could make out dates spanning decades. Interspersed with cryptic entries about weather patterns and lighthouse maintenance were disturbing sketches, crude, unsettling drawings of things that defied easy classification, amorphous shapes with too many eyes, sinuous tentacles coiling around unseen forms, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and pulse on the page. Some pages were entirely filled with these patterns, repeated obsessively, as if trying to capture some impossible geometry. Dean's breath hitched on a page where a single phrase was scrawled, underlined repeatedly, almost gouged into the paper. The deep song calls to them. It pulls them down. Beneath it, a drawing of a human-like figure, its face a mask of terror, being dragged into a swirling vortex of dark water. Another entry, dated years later, read, "The tides respond. A hunger awakens." This wasn't just eccentricity, this was obsession. He traced the lines of a particularly disturbing sketch, a creature that seemed to be all mouth and grasping appendages, its form barely discernible in the murky depths depicted. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. His grandfather had been a recluse, yes, but had he also been unwell? Dean tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was the ramblings of an isolated old man, driven to paranoia by solitude and the relentless expanse of the sea. Determined to find a rational explanation for the unusual tidal patterns, Dean decided to visit the island's small weather station. It was a functional, unadorned building nestled on a rise overlooking a different part of the coast, manned by a single, taciturn attendant. The station attendant, a man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed permanently fixed on the horizon, greeted him with a curt nod. "Afternoon," Dean offered, trying to sound casual. "Noticed the tides have been a bit high lately. Anything unusual on the readings?" The station attendant consulted a monitor displaying a dizzying array of graphs and numbers. He tapped a few keys, his brow furrowing slightly. "Negative, for the most part. Slight variations. Sure, but nothing outside normal parameters for this time of year. No storm systems brewing, no unusual lunar alignment flag." He glanced at Dean, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Why, something specific you're looking for?" Dean forced a smile. "Just curious. Cartographer, you know, precision is key." He felt a strange disquiet. His own observations, undeniable to his trained eye, were contradicted by the official data. Was he mistaken? Was his grief truly distorting his perceptions? The station attendant shrugged, returning to his work, seemingly unfazed. Walking back toward the cottage, the wind picked up again, carrying with it that same low hum, that faint, unsettling chorus. This time, Dean didn't dismiss it as easily. He clutched the journal tighter, the worn leather feeling strangely alive in his hand. And Dean, against his will, was beginning to hear it. The shrug from the weather station attendant had been a physical manifestation of Dean's gnawing doubt. He'd driven away from the small, utilitarian building, the gravel crunching beneath his tires, leaving behind the neat rows of instruments and the man's placid dismissal. The official data, neatly charted and filed, painted a picture of stability, of predictable tides and consistent landmass. Yet, Dean's own eyes, His cartographer's training whispered a different truth. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the coastline, the way the water seemed to lap higher against the rock formations near the lighthouse, it was all there, undeniable to him. Was his grief truly so potent, so insidious, that it could warp the very bedrock of his perception? The thought was a cold, alien thing, tightening around his chest. Back in the cottage, the air felt heavy, damp with the sea's breath. His grandfather's study, a room he'd initially avoided, now called to him with a strange urgency. The scent of aged paper and forgotten pipe tobacco hung in the air, a phantom comfort. He began his research methodically, pulling down heavy, leather-bound volumes from the shelves. Local histories, geological surveys, anecdotal accounts from long-dead islanders. His fingers, stained with printer's ink from his own work, now picked through brittle pages, tracing lines of faded text. Hours blurred into a singular, focused pursuit. Tales of the island's earliest inhabitants, a forgotten tribe whose reverence for the sea bordered on obsession. They spoke of his sleeping god beneath the waves, a vast, ancient presence that demanded tribute. One particular passage in a crumbling, self-published local folklore collection caught his eye. It was guarded, the text claimed, by a warden of the deep, a creature of immense power. The islanders, in their desperation during lean seasons, were said to have performed ancient rites to appease this entity, ensuring their catches and protecting their shores. He pushed the heavy book aside, his gaze falling upon his grandfather's journal, which lay open on the desk where he'd left it. With the new context, the frantic, almost illegible scrawl began to yield its secrets. Phrases that had seemed like the ramblings of a man succumbing to isolation now sharpened into focus. The packed and broken for generations, the tides demand their due. The old man hadn't been mad, he'd been afraid. And Dean, now, understood why. The two worlds collided, leaving him disoriented and profoundly disturbed. He finally pushed away from the desk, the weight of the accumulated knowledge pressing down on him. The sky outside had turned a bruised purple, and the first stars pricked through the deepening twilight. Exhaustion, a thick, suffocating blanket, claimed him. Sleep did not bring peace. He was underwater, yet he could breathe. The sensation both terrifying and exhilarating. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distorted, guttural whispers that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Shapes, vast and indistinct, moved in the peripheral gloom, impossibly large, ancient. He saw glimpses of colossal, cyclopean architecture, structures that defied earthly physics, rising from the Inkai depths like forgotten mountains. The water was not clear. It was thick, viscous, like liquid night, and within it, something pulsed, a faint, rhythmic glow that seemed to beckon, to promise, to threaten. He was an explorer, after all, and this was the ultimate unknown. It knew him. It had been waiting. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, convinced the dream had somehow bled into reality. But it hadn't. On the wooden windowsill, nestled amongst the dust and a few stray cobwebs, was a patch of something alien. It glowed with a soft, ethereal blue, a bioluminescent algae unlike anything he had ever seen. It was merely clinging to the wood. It seemed to be growing from it, a living, breathing part of the cottage now. He reached out a hesitant finger, but recoiled before making contact. The sea had not merely whispered to him in his dreams. It had left a tangible, glowing mark, a silent, chilling promise of its encroaching presence. Dean drove back to the cottage, the image of the weather station attendant's shrug still clinging to him like a damp shroud. The man's placid dismissal, the neat rows of instruments, the official data, none of it aligned with the churning unease that had settled deep in Dean's gut. The island's official records might declare the weather normal, but the air around him hummed with an unnatural chill, a subtle discord that grated against his nerves. He knew what he felt, what he heard, even if no barometer could measure it. The cottage, when he finally saw it through the thinning mist, looked less like a sanctuary and more like a sentinel hunched against the relentless sea. A shiver traced its way down his spine, unrelated to the wind. He parked the jeep, the engine's rumble quickly swallowed by the vast oceanic silence. The door, which he was certain he'd latched securely, now stood ajar, groaning faintly on its hinges. Inside, the silence was thicker, heavier than he remembered. A floorboard creaked upstairs, a sound too deliberate to be merely the settling of an old house. He stood in the entryway listening, his breath catching in his throat. Then, from the small, cluttered study off the main living area, a soft thud. He moved towards it, his footsteps unnervingly loud on the wooden floor. A book lay open on the worn rug, face down. It was a local history, one he'd placed carefully on the top shelf of a bookcase just that morning. He knew he had. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the rough, dusty cover. It was deep, guttural, like the distant thrum of a leviathan's heart, pulsing rhythmically with the cadence of the waves outside. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a vast, patient awareness. He found himself drawn to the small, tarnished mirror in the hallway, an antique piece with an ornate, flaking frame. He stared at his reflection, willing the hum to cease, willing his own fear to recede. For a horrifying moment, the lines of his face seemed to deepen, his skin to slacken, his jaw to elongate. He backed away from the mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep, persistent hum. The hum intensified, pulling him toward the back of the cottage, to a small, seldom used pantry that his grandfather had kept locked. Dean had picked the old lock weeks ago, but hadn't properly explored its contents. Now, the pantry door stood ajar, revealing a narrow, musty space beyond. A faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and decaying seaweed, drifted out. He pushed the door fully open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Within the small cavity, Dean found a collection of unsettling objects. A thick, leather-bound law book, its pages brittle and stained with what looked like dried salt water, lay atop a small pile of crude, hand-carved wooden fetishes resembling grotesque, multi-limbed creatures. Beside them were several small, irregularly shaped stones, each one encrusted with barnacles and etched with unfamiliar symbols that seemed to writhe beneath his gaze. He picked up the logbook, its weight heavy in his hands. The air in the pantry dropped several degrees, and the earthy smell intensified, now mingled with the sharp tang of ozone. He spun around, logbook still clutched in his hand. It was formless yet defined, a shifting silhouette of pure aqueous malice. He caught a glimpse of something within its depths, a fleeting impression of myriad, unblinking eyes, or perhaps just the play of light on churning blackness. A guttural sound, like water struggling through a constricted pipe, emanated from the shifting form. It wasn't a roar, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and reverberate directly in his chest. Dean stumbled back, tripping over the loose floorboard, sending the wooden fetishes clattering. He gasped, scrambling backwards, adrenaline coursing through him. He crashed against the wall, dropping the logbook with a dull thud. The aqueous form paused, its shifting bulk seeming to consider him, to taste the fear radiating from him. The hum receded with it, retreating to the edges of his perception. Though he knew it hadn't vanished entirely, he pressed himself against the wall, breathing heavily, his entire body trembling. His grandfather hadn't just been a reclusive old man. He had been a guard, perhaps even a reluctant participant, in a horrific, long-standing pact. And now, whatever his grandfather had kept at bay was awake, and it had found Dean. The cold, damp breath that had brushed Dean's neck lingered, an invisible, clammy hand leaving a trail of goose flesh. He stood rigid in the pantry, the earthy smell of the potatoes now thick with the acrid bite of ozone. He clamped his eyes shut, willing it away, but it merely intensified, a pressure building behind his eyeballs. When he finally dared to open them, the small pantry seemed to swim. Dean's breath hitched. It's just exhaustion, he told himself, though the conviction felt thin, fragile. He backed away slowly, his hand finding the rough wood of the doorframe, then the solid oak of the kitchen door. He needed light, stable ground, something real. He stumbled into the main living area, the familiar clutter of his grandfather's life a welcome anchor. He had to understand. He reopened the journal, his fingers tracing the familiar, spidery script. He ignored the passages he'd already translated, his gaze searching for the unturned stones, the phrases that still resisted his efforts. He found a section detailing a precise sequence of observations, a schedule of vigilance. His grandfather had marked down tidal shifts, lunar phases, and then, inexplicably, specific atmospheric pressures and wind directions, cross-referencing them with readings taken from the old apparatus at the weather station. Dean frowned. Why would a lighthouse keeper be so meticulously tracking weather data beyond standard forecasts? The entries weren't just observations, they were preparations. When the currents align and the atmospheric pressure drops below the threshold, the barrier thins. One entry, read. The ink faded but distinct. Another, scrawled in a frantic hand, the deep song rises. It must be met. The calibration at the weather station is paramount for the resonant frequencies. Only then can the true binding begin. Dean's stomach lurched. His grandfather wasn't merely a chronicler of some ancient horror. He was an active participant, a guardian, a warden. He had been performing a ritual, a binding, to keep the entity dormant. The weather station, which Dean had dismissed as a simple meteorological outburst, was a vital component, a focal point for his grandfather's grim work. He pictured the dilapidated building on the island's highest point, imagining some forgotten, strange device humming within its walls, a counterpart to the unseen forces now pressing in on him. The deep song the journal spoke of, it was the hum. It had been there all along, a low thrum beneath the island, but now it was louder, more insistent. It felt like a drill boring into his skull, not painful, but deeply unsettling. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear his head, but the sound persisted, growing in complexity. He began to hear faint, discordant notes within it, like a vast, submerged choir singing a dirge from an unimaginable depth. He stared at a passage, the words blurring, the vessel the offering the descent. His eyes unfocused. The old grandfather clock in the corner, usually a silent sentinel, seemed to lean towards him, its polished wood rippling like water. He blinked hard. The clock solidified, but the unsettling feeling remained. Was he imagining it? It was the deep song twisting his perceptions. A faint metallic scent, like ancient iron and wet stone, wafted past him. It was a smell he'd encountered before, deep within the lighthouse, near the foundation. He remembered the faint draft, the sense of something hidden. The journal, open on his lap, seemed to vibrate in rhythm with the hum. His gaze fell upon a sketch his grandfather had made, crudely drawn, but unmistakably a cross-section of the lighthouse's base, with a dotted line leading to a space beneath the foundation. A small, almost illegible note beside it read, "The crypt for the binding." The crypt! His grandfather hadn't just observed, he had contained. He scrambled to his feet, the journal falling to the floor with a soft thud. He ignored it. He moved with a new, frantic purpose, his steps echoing on the wooden floorboards. He knew where to look. He'd felt the draft, smelled the damp earth and iron. The hum here was a physical force, pressing against his chest, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He reached the lowest level, the original foundation stones of the lighthouse, massive and rough-hewn. He remembered the faint line, the almost imperceptible seam in the stone. He found it near the old well pump, almost hidden by centuries of grime and moss. It wasn't a crack, but a meticulously cut line, barely visible. He pressed against the stone, then pulled, then pushed again, desperate. Not there. He was losing his grip. A lot. He fumbled with it, his fingers clumsy, until with a sharp click, it gave way. A section of the massive stone wall, previously indistinguishable from the rest, slowly, silently, swung inward. The metallic, earthy smell intensified, now mingled with something else, something ancient and profoundly wrong. He had found his grandfather's crypt, and whatever lay within, whatever his grandfather had struggled to bind, was now waiting for him. The realization, sharp and cold, had sliced through the disorienting thrum of the deep song. Dean's breath hitched, his lungs burning with an unfamiliar urgency. The journal, a heavy block of bound secrets, lay forgotten on the floorboards as he scrambled to his feet. His mind, still reeling from the hallucinatory whispers and the abyssal echoes that threatened to unravel his sanity, latched on to that single, concrete word, crypt. It was a tether, however frayed, to something tangible, something he could confront. The fog, a dense, wet shroud, had descended further, swallowing the already muted light of the overcast sky. It pressed in, thick and suffocating, muffling the roar of the waves to a distant, hungry sigh. The old weather station. It was the only structure on the island large enough, sturdy enough to house such a secret. His boots crunched on the gravel path, then squelched into the waterlogged earth as he veered off, following a barely discernible deer trail through the gnarled, salt-blasted scrub. He saw shapes in the swirling mist, the skeletal branches of ancient trees reaching like grasping claws, the fleeting shadow of a seabird transformed into a monstrous, winged sentinel. He ignored them, or tried to. His gaze remained fixed on the vague, gray mass ahead, the silhouette of the weather station, a desolate sentinel against the encroaching nothingness. The structure loomed, a concrete hulk weathered by decades of salt and wind, its windows gaping like vacant eyes. Rust bled in crimson streaks down its reinforced walls. The heavy metal door, half off its hinges, groaned a protest as Dean pushed it open, revealing an interior swallowed by perpetual twilight. The air inside was still and heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete, mildew, and something else. Something metallic and faintly saline, like old blood mixed with brine. Broken instruments lay scattered, their dials shattered, their wires severed. A large, rusted console dominated one wall, its myriad buttons and levers frozen in time. Dean's eyes scanned the floor, the walls, searching for any irregularity. It was in a small, forgotten alcove, obscured by a collapsed shelf, that he found it. A faint discoloration in the concrete, almost imperceptible. He pressed, pushed, pulled, and with a grinding groan that made the very foundations of the station tremble, a section of the floor, a perfectly cut square, began to descend. Below, a shaft of rough-hewn rock descended into absolute blackness. Dean hesitated for only a fraction of a second, the tendrils of the deep song attempting to ensnare his resolve once more, but the image of his grandfather's desperate scrawl, contained, burned brighter. He found a rusted metal ladder bolted to the rock face and began his descent, each rung slick with moisture, each step a further plunge into the unknown. The chamber below was not vast, but it felt immeasurable. The air was frigid, pressing in on him, stealing the warmth from his bones. The sound of dripping water was everywhere, a constant, maddening rhythm. And then he saw it. In the center of the chamber, nested within a shallow, circular depression, was an object that defied description. Its surface was not smooth, but rippled with subtle, organic undulations, as if a titanic, subterranean heart beat within. Strange, angular symbols, unlike any he had ever seen, were etched into its surface, glowing faintly with the same unearthly light. It hummed, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not just through the air, but through his very bones, a direct echo of the deep song, amplified 1,000-fold. As Dean stared, mesmerized and horrified, a tendril of that pulsating light reached out from the sphere, a shimmering, ethereal rope that wrapped around his mind. He gasped, a silent, choked sound, as a vision exploded into his consciousness, not seen with his eyes, but felt, absorbed, lived. He was no longer in the chamber. He was within the sphere, or perhaps, the sphere was within him. The lighthouse, a beacon of defiance, shattered and fell. The vision intensified, showing him the ultimate fate. The entire island, a mere stepping stone, sinking slowly, inexorably, into an unfathomable depth. A new, monstrous appendage growing from the ocean floor, reaching towards the mainland. Then, just as suddenly, the vision snapped shut, the tendril of light retracting. Dean stumbled back, gagging, his hand flying to his mouth, though there was nothing there to expel. He fell to his knees on the damp stone, gasping for air that felt thin and acrid. The hum of the sphere was still there, a constant, insidious presence, but now he understood it. It wasn't just a sound, it was a promise of transformation, of absorption, of the world he knew being dragged, screaming and drowning, into an endless, lightless deep. And he, Dean, was meant to be its harbinger. He snatched it up, the leather cool and dry against his sweating palm, the weight of it suddenly immense. The cottage around him groaned, not with the familiar settling of old wood, but with a deeper internal tremor. The air grew thick, like breathing cold, wet ash. The deep song intensified, no longer a distant hum, but a resonant chord vibrating through the floorboards, up his legs, settling behind his sternum. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical pressure, a vast, unseen weight pressing down on the small structure on him. It was trying to get in. It was trying to take him. He wasn't just being watched. He was being probed. He ripped it open, scattering brittle, dried leaves that had been pressed between the pages, smelling faintly of salt and something metallic, like old blood. He flipped through the journal, frantic, his grandfather's precise, looping script blurred before his eyes. The deep song pulsed, a relentless bass note accompanied by higher, keening tones that seemed to pluck at the very fibers of his brain. There, a series of entries, dated years apart, each marked with a small, unsettling symbol, a concentric spiral with a jagged, broken line through its center. The handwriting in these sections was less steady, more desperate, ink bleeding slightly as if pressed with too much force. He squinted, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. One entry, scrawled in what looked like hurried desperation, caught his eye. It detailed a location, not by name, but by its coordinates relative to the island's highest point, and a cryptic reference, the eye that watches the sky. Dean's mind raced. The highest point, the weather station. Oh, of course! His grandfather had spent hours there, meticulously recording atmospheric data, but Dean had always assumed it was just a hobby, a way to pass the lonely hours. Now he understood. It was a vigil. The journal entry continued, hinting at a final component necessary for binding the encroacher, something his grandfather had feared to use. It was incomplete, fragmented, as if the writer had been interrupted, or had deliberately left out the most crucial, most terrible detail. There was a crude map showing a path from the cottage, winding through the gnarled gorse and rockfalls, leading directly to the squat, concrete structure of the weather station. Outside, the fog was a living thing, thicker than he'd ever seen it, swirling like ectoplasm around the cottage. It muffled the crash of waves, making the island feel impossibly vast and utterly silent, save for the insistent, internal thrum of the deep song. Each step on the slippery, uneven ground was a battle against the unseen. He could feel eyes on him, not physical, but a profound, crushing awareness from beneath the waves tracking his every move. He stumbled, his knees scraping against jagged rock, but the pain was a welcome anchor to reality. He pushed through the suffocating mist, the beam of his lantern cutting a pathetic circle in the impenetrable gray. The path to the weather station was steeper than he remembered, the climb arduous, but he kept moving, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that standing still was an invitation to be swallowed whole. Its instruments, the anemometer and wind vane, were still frozen sentinels. The door, a heavy steel plate, was secured by a rusted padlock. The lock groaned, then clicked open with a sound like a snapping bone. Charts and graphs lined the walls, recording decades of wind speed, temperature, and barometric pressure. But it wasn't peace he sought. The journal had mentioned a final component. He scanned the cramped space, his gaze falling on a small, wooden chest tucked beneath a rickety workbench. It was plain, unadorned, and strangely out of place amidst the scientific instruments. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. The lid was unlocked. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, obsidian shard, impossibly black, absorbing the lantern light without reflection. Beside it, a rolled parchment, tied with a simple twine. He unrolled it, his eyes devouring the precise script. It was the final piece. A ritual, not for sealing a portal, but for containing the entity, for forcing it back into dormancy. And the sacrifice, it was far, far worse. The parchment described the sacrifice as the anchor to the living. It spoke of severing the deepest emotional connection, the one tethering the individual to their profoundest grief, their most cherished memory of loss. It was the memory of his wife, the sharp, exquisite pain of her absence, the love he still clung to. That was the entity's price. To forget her, to wipe away the very essence of his sorrow, to become an empty vessel, free from pain, free from love. The obsidian shard pulsed faintly, a silent invitation. The deep song outside swelled, a siren call promising peace, if only he would pay the terrible toll. Dean stared at the parchment, then at the black stone, his mind reeling. The entity wanted him to sacrifice his humanity, the very thing that made him him. He could stop it, yes, but at what cost? He looked out into the impediment to Wolfag, the island, a tomb, the sea, a humby maw. The choice was stark, absolute, and utterly horrifying. Dean didn't need to look at it to feel the weight of its revelations. The crypt, a fragile, desperate containment, now crumbling under the relentless pressure of the deep song. Dean's breath hitched, his lungs burning with an unfamiliar urgency that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with dread. He knelt, retrieving the journal, his fingers tracing the faded ink of the final entries. The handwriting, usually precise, had grown jagged, frantic, betraying the elder man's unraveling resolve. Dean scanned the dense script, his eyes darting across archaic symbols and cryptic warnings. The deep song intensified, a low, guttural hum vibrating through the very timbers of the cottage, rattling the window panes. Outside, the world was dissolving into a storm unlike any he ever witnessed. The wind shrieked, a hungry, living thing tearing at the roof. Rain hammered down, not in drops, but in sheets, obscuring the lighthouse beam into a faint, struggling pulse. He read of the counter-ritual, not a sealing, but a severing. A final, desperate measure to end the pact that bound the entity to the island's shores. The words blurred, then sharpened, coalescing into a horrifying clarity. The heart of the storm. The ritual had to be enacted at the nexus of the island's raw power during the entity's most aggressive manifestation. And the sacrifice, it wasn't of blood, but of essence. A part of the one who dared to challenge the deep. His grandfather had documented its chilling inevitability, a profound, irreversible change, a fragment of the abyssal domain forever scarring the soul. His grandfather hadn't just died, he'd been consumed, twisted, perhaps even became a part of the containment itself. It was the weather station, perched on the island's highest, most exposed ridge. A shiver traced Dean's spine. Oh, of course! The place designed to monitor the island's moods would also be the most vulnerable, the most attuned to its fundamental nature. It was where the veil between worlds would be thinnest. The cottage groaned around him, the deep song now a roaring crescendo that filled his skull, pressing against his eardrums. Now, stepping outside was like walking into the maw of a beast. The rain was a physical assault, stinging his skin, blinding him. He squinted, trying to discern the path to the weather station, but the familiar landscape had warped. The sparse, wind-stunted trees writhed like tortured limbs, their branches clawing at the tumultuous sky. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, as if the very earth was softening, liquefying. His mind struggled to anchor itself, to distinguish between the storm's chaos and the entity's insidious influence. Halfway up the ridge, the transformations became more pronounced, more grotesque. Patches of kelp, usually confined to the shore, had somehow appeared inland, crawling across the ground, their tendrils thick and strangely segmented, like the limbs of something nameless. They twitched and swayed in the unnatural wind, reaching, always reaching. Dean had to step over them, his stomach churning at their clammy touch. He pressed on, his resolve hardening with every horrifying sight. He thought of his grandfather, of the silent battle he'd waged, of the burden he'd carried alone. Dean wouldn't falter. He couldn't. The island was a maelstrom, a living, breathing nightmare, and he was walking directly into its heart. The deep song was no longer just sound. It was a physical force, a vibration that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. Finally, through the driving rain and swirling mist, the silhouette of the weather station loomed. It was a squat, concrete structure, usually unremarkable, but now it seemed to throb with a malevolent energy. The wind vane atop its roof spun wildly, emitting a high-pitched, metallic shriek that grated on Dean's nerves. One of the windows was shattered, a jagged tooth in the station's grimace, and from within, a faint, Rhythmic thump-thump-thump echoed, like a monstrous heart beating just beneath the surface. He reached the entrance, the metal door rattling furiously in its frame. This was where the final act would unfold. The personal cost was immense, a gaping maw ready to swallow not just his life, but his very self. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The journal still clutched in his hand, its secrets laid bare, its final, terrible instruction echoing in his mind. He was ready. The crypt, a fragile, desperate containment. Now, Dean pushed himself to his feet, a tremor running through his legs that had nothing to do with fatigue. It was the island itself, groaning under an unbearable strain, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth. He grabbed the satchel, its leather straps digging into his shoulder as he cinched it tight. Inside, the compass, the specific charts he'd painstakingly corrected from his grandfather's notes, and a small, heavy iron key, the one that had unlocked the crypt, now a symbol of both discovery and burden. His grandfather's final, frantic scrawl echoed in his mind, seal it. At the heart, before it tears open everything, the lighthouse. It was their only place. The wind outside howled, a banshee's shriek that tore at the cottage soul timbers. Rain lashed against the windows, not just water, but a thick, viscous spray that seemed to carry the sea's ancient brine, a taste of metallic cold on his tongue even indoors. He stepped out, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and shadow. The path to the lighthouse, usually a familiar, winding track, was now a treacherous ascent against an invisible, crushing force. He stumbled, his knees scraping against jagged rock, but the pain was a distant thing, overridden by the growing pressure in his skull. Reaching the base of the lighthouse, Dean found the massive iron door shuddering on its hinges, groaning like a living thing in agony. The spiral staircase stretched upwards, a dizzying helix into the unknown. A strange, phosphorescent glow emanated from above. A sickly, shifting light that painted the rough-hewn stone in impossible shades of green and purple. It pulsed slow and rhythmic like a colossal, dying heart. It glistened, somehow both solid and fluid. They clawed at his mind, seeking purchase, trying to unravel the threads of his sanity. He saw flashes, not memories, but distorted echoes of his profound personal tragedy, his loss twisted into grotesque caricatures mocking his grief, promising release if only he would let go. He fought them, clenching his jaw, focusing on the weight of the key in his satchel, the purpose that propelled him upwards. He was a cartographer, a man of lines and boundaries, of defining what was and what was not. This was a boundary that needed to be drawn, a line that needed to be held. The massive Fresnel lens, meant to pierce the fog, was shattered in places, its remaining prisms catching the strange glow and scattering it into a chaotic kaleidoscope. At the very center of the room, where the lamp should have been, the air shimmered. It was a doorway, a hungry mouth opening into something that defied all understanding of form and matter. The entity wasn't a creature with eyes or teeth, not in any conventional sense. It was the source of the impossible colors, the shifting geometry of the room where walls seemed to curve inwards and upwards at the same time, defying logic. It was a presence that sought to unravel him, to pull him, piece by agonizing piece, into its domain. Dean dropped his satchel, scattering his instruments across the grimy floor. His grandfather's journal had been vague on the final steps, hinting at a binding of self, a sacrificial anchoring. He understood now. The entity sought a point of entity, a weakness, a tether to this reality, and he, Dean, was its strongest tether. He pulled out the compass, its needle spinning wildly, uselessly, trying to point to something beyond north. He found the specific chart from his satchel, one he had drawn himself, a complex overlay of the island's ley lines and his own emotional landscape, a map of his grief. He knew the cost of such a promise. It would be a lie, a betrayal of everything. He remembered his grandfather's last, desperate entry. The keeper does not merely observe. He binds. He becomes the anchor. Dean closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself. He had to become the barrier, the vital line on the map. He had to give it a place to bind itself, to contain it, to make himself the prison. He unfolded a second, blank chart, a pristine sheet of heavy parchment, the kind he used for his most precise work. He laid it over the first, overlapping, symbolic of a new boundary. He took the iron key, the heavy, ancient key from the crypt, and pressed it into the center of the blank map directly over the spot where the entity's presence was strongest. It wasn't an act of locking, but of embedding. He felt himself being stretched, pulled, his essence thinning as if he were being drawn into the tear. This was the sacrifice, not his life, but his freedom, his ability to ever truly leave this island, to ever truly disconnect from this ancient, hungry thing. A searing pain shot through his hand as the key seemed to fuse with the parchment, burning into the fibers, leaving a mark that was both physical and metaphysical. He focused all his will, all his grief, all his determination into that single point of contact. Here, you stay here. You do not pass. The room shuddered. The impossible colors flickered, then dimmed. The pressure eased minutely, but noticeably. It became still, a window into another, terrifying dimension, but a window that was now sealed, held in place by his act, by his sacrifice. Dean collapsed, his hand still pressed to the key, his body trembling, utterly spent. The strange, phosphorescent glow in the lighthouse began to fade, replaced by the faint, gray light of a dawn that promised no comfort, only a new, terrifying reality. He was still alive, but he was no longer free. He was the keeper now. He was the anger. The entity was contained, for now, and he was its prison. The impossible colors had bled away, leaving the world a stark, unforgiving canvas of gray and black. The crushing pressure on his skull had eased, but the phantom ache lingered, a dull throb behind his eyes, a residual tremor in his bones. Dean stumbled, his legs refusing to hold him steady, and collapsed onto the cold, damp floor of the cottage. The air, thick with the smell of brine and something acrid metallic, felt heavy in his lungs, each breath a struggle. The receding growl, a sound like tectonic plates grinding beneath a mile of ocean, still vibrated in the foundations of the island, a defeated, yet potent echo. He lay there, gasping for what felt like an eternity, his mind a fractured mosaic of images, the churning abyss, the impossible geometry, the endless, hungry maw. He had pushed it back, or perhaps it had simply decided to retreat, sated for the moment, or recognizing a new, unwelcome presence. Dean didn't know which thought was more terrifying. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled again. Slowly, painfully, Dean pushed himself upright. His muscles screamed in protest, every joint ached. His hands, when he looked at them, trembled uncontrollably, and a faint, shimmering iridescence seemed to cling to his skin, catching the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. He shook his head, trying to clear the lingering haze, but the world still seemed subtly off-kilter. The edges of reality blurred. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had just happened, what he had done. The only place he could think of, a place his grandfather had spent countless hours, was the old weather station. It stood on the island's highest point, a squat, stone structure perpetually battered by wind and rain, a silent sentinel overlooking the churning sea. The fog, a dense, swirling shroud, had returned with a vengeance, muffling the sound of the waves, turning the familiar path into a treacherous, unseen obstacle course. The walk was a brutal test of endurance. Each step was an act of will, his mind still reeling, his body protesting. This was physical, external, almost a welcome distraction from the internal frost. He kept his gaze fixed on the faint, pulsating glow of the lighthouse beam, a distant, unreliable guide through the opaque gray. Finally, the weather station materialized out of the fog, its silhouette stark against the monochrome sky. The heavy wooden door groaned open with a mournful sigh, revealing an interior steeped in the scent of damp stone, ozone, and old paper. The wind whistled through unseen cracks, making the old instruments hum and rattle. Dean moved to the central desk, a scarred oak slab littered with rusted barometers, an ancient shortwave radio, and stacks of yellow charts. His grandfather's presence was palpable here, a lingering echo in the air. Inside, nestled amongst faded photographs of his grandfather and a woman Dean didn't recognize, was a thick, leather-bound journal. It wasn't a weather log. Its pages were filled with a spidery, familiar hand, but the entries were unlike anything Dean had ever seen. They spoke of cycles of tides, not of the moon, but of something far older, far deeper. They spoke of a burden, a pact maintained through generations, a necessary vigilance against the deep song that hummed beneath the waves. He read, his eyes devouring the frantic script, the words carving themselves into his mind. His grandfather hadn't been a mere lighthouse keeper. He had been a warden, a guardian against the very entity Dean had just confronted. The journal detailed rituals, not of magic, but a focus of mental fortitude, of a constant, exhausting battle to keep the barrier intact, to keep the deep song from rising. The cost, his grandfather had written in trembling ink, was a piece of oneself with each turning tide, a slow erosion of the soul. Then Dean found it, the final entry, dated just days before his grandfather's disappearance. It described a growing weakness in the barrier, an impending surge of the deep song's power, and a desperate, harrowing plea for a successor, for someone to listen and understand the ancient hum. The blood remembers, the entry concluded, and the island chooses its own. The defeated growl wasn't a retreat, it was an acceptance. The entity hadn't been pushed back, it had simply recognized its new guardian. They were an initiation. Dean was the new keeper. The burden, the pact, the unending vigilance. It was all his now. The island hadn't offered him solitude, it had claimed him. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. He was trapped, not by chains, but by knowledge, by an inherited duty that had already begun to unravel the fragile threads of his sanity. He was listening.